Good morning, WHAPers. We are on Unit 4, Part 2. We are making our way through the WHAP curriculum. We discussed last time Columbus and discovering the New World and how we have these new centralized European monarchies that are sponsoring exploration, starting with the Portuguese and Henry the Navigator and Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama. And then the rest of Europe gets jealous and wants to participate in the age of exploration and looking for a route to Asia called and so therefore we're going to see the Spanish commission Columbus to sail the ocean blue in 1492, make his way over hopefully to Asia, but no, he doesn't find Asia. Instead, he finds the island that he names Hispaniola in the Caribbean, and this is going to start what becomes a wave of colonization, both in the Indian Ocean, starting with the Portuguese, and then later the Dutch and the English, and then also in the New World, with first the Portuguese and the Spanish, but then come the English, the French, and the Dutch. So we have a lot going on in this time period, guys. This is one of our most active time periods, 1450 to 1750. And let's kind of talk through what we're doing here. So we've talked about the nation states emerging under absolute monarchs. We talked last class about the age of exploration, the Columbian Exchange. We're going to talk today about interactions between Europe, Africa, and the America and how it causes syncretic cultures and religions. I know we talked about that a little bit last time. We're also going to talk about mercantilism, joint stock companies, the economies, how the economy is affected by this first wave of colonization. Down at the bottom, some dates for reference. We still have the Renaissance sweeping through Europe. That's relevant because the Renaissance shows the emerging middle class, and it shows that we have money in Europe that can be used by the middle class for whatever ventures, and some of those ventures include joint stock companies. And we see some of our first most powerful examples of colonization are going to be joint stock companies. When you think about the British East India Company in India, it's a joint stock company, or the Dutch East India Company in Indonesia, Malaysia, same thing. Or if you talk about the Jamestown with the Virginia Company, that's another joint stock company. So the Renaissance sweeping through Europe, talking about the amount of money that the middle class has, is significant when talking about the age of exploration. Obviously, Columbus is self-explanatory. And then the British East India Company forming, we know that that is the start of British influence in India. Okay, so we start today just by talking about the nations that do not get involved in exploration and colonization, and that is China and Japan. East Asia, again, and I know I've said this several times, but I do want to kind of try to make sure that we get this point. East Asia has been the most powerful region in the world up until 1450. And after Zhang He's voyages, it's kind of like the turning point in history where Western Europe starts to become much more powerful and East Asia starts to decline as far as relative power to Western Europe. The Ming Dynasty, just to give a little context again of Zhang He's voyages, it's very conservative. It's the one after the Yuan Dynasty, the Mongol dynasty started by Kublai Khan, and they're going to try to revert back to the ideas of the Song Dynasty and the classic Chinese ideas of Confucianism with the national school system, bringing back the civil service exam, all of these things. And then that gives a little context, of course, to this guy Zhang He's voyages, because he goes on these long, long voyages that show already that the Chinese are the best seamen in the world and that they have the capabilities to go out and travel to faraway places. And, looking at this date, 1405 to 1433, they do this before anybody else has the capabilities to go out and explore as far as Zhang He did. But it is because the Ming Dynasty is so conservative, so Confucianist, that they are going to look at Zhang He bringing back all of these wonderful gifts and treasures from faraway places and say that this is a threat to the Chinese social order. Confucianism is based on tradition, it's based on honoring the ancestors, and we can't be distracted with faraway glories and pleasures. And so, because of this, the scholar gentry convinces the emperor, let us discourage the rest of the country, the Chinese merchants especially, from sailing away from China. And this will start our era of Chinese isolation, which occurs under the Ming, where the emperor is going to prohibit private foreign trade, destroy some dockyards, ban ships with more than 2 masts. Of course, that is significant, the 2 masts, because the Portuguese caravel, for instance, the only ship at this point that is able to sail around the Cape of Good Hope and really go into the Atlantic Ocean and this deep oceanic voyages, have 3 masts. And so this is effectively ensuring that Chinese isolation it happens. And while the Ming dynasty declines and the Qing dynasty comes in, the Qing dynasty is going to keep most elements of isolation. Yes, it's going to re-enter global trade, but at first it's only going to be the state-controlled trade. And what it means by that is the government is going to control all trade coming into China. For instance, they do allow silver to come into their country from Manila, which is obviously a Spanish-controlled colony. But they're not allowing foreign merchants to come into China. This is a big element of their isolationism. And foreign merchants desperately want to come into China for all the wonderful wares that they have. And therefore, there's going to be a big competition over the one port that is open to foreign merchants, which is Guangzhou. And Guangzhou is only open because Emperor Qianlong has spent so much money expanding China by land during this time period. And so, of course, this sets up the Opium Wars in the 19th century. Japan is going to follow China in this era. We know we've talked about the 3 unifiers of Japan that occurs during this time period with Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu is going to establish the Tokugawa shogunate, which still is, for most intents and purposes, feudalism, but there is a central government. And the daimyo are no longer fighting each other. They have to be loyal to the central government because of the system in place in which the daimyo's families have to keep a residence in the capital when they go back to visit their home Han. Now, the reason we talk about Japan in this time period is because Japan is going to get a dose of Western Europeans arriving over in East Asia, just like China does. The Portuguese are going to arrive in 1542, and the Portuguese and the Spanish are heavily Catholic, and they are going to bring over the Jesuits, their missionaries, to come in and attempt to convert people, to convert souls to Christianity. The Portuguese arrive first, followed by the Dutch. At first, they're tolerated, and they're tolerated mostly because they bring weapons. They bring gunpowder weapons, which, of course, our 3 unifiers of Japan use to unify the country into one government. But finally, our second unifier of Japan, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, is going to look at it as a threat, as Christianity as a threat, because Christians became intolerant of Buddhism, and Buddhism being the most popular religion in Japan in the time period. And because of this, Toyotomi Hideyoshi is going to ban all Christian worship. 10 years later, when people aren't taking him seriously, he's going to execute 26 Christians. This is going to start an era where Christians are persecuted in Japan. And because of this, many Christians that became very deeply devoted to their faith had to worship in secret. These were called our hidden Christians of Japan. It's silly, but the way I always remind students to remember that Toyotomi Hideyoshi is the one that bans all Christian worship is to say Hideyoshi, he's a Christian. And we look at Hideyoshi, it's spelled that way, so it always easy to remember for that reason. Japan is going to turn to isolationism just as China does. And they're going to do this because, again, like China, they have a resistance of foreign cultures coming into their country. Japan is going to do this, and it falls under culture, but they're going to do this for religious reasons. They don't like that Christianity has permutated into their country so much. And in the 1630s, all foreigners are expelled. Only Japanese are allowed in Japan. Foreign books are prohibited, and you cannot travel abroad. I mean, this is really, really strict isolationism, even more than China. And they stay completely isolated from the rest of the world until 1853. And they would have stayed isolated longer, if you recall. 1853 is when Matthew Perry of the United States arrives in Japan to seek trade. This is in our second era of colonization. Of course, we're still in our first era of colonization here. Japan, it does allow two small exceptions to their complete isolationism. One is Dutch merchants allowed to live in a very small island in Nagasaki Harbor, especially because they provide weapons, provide gunpowder, and then trade with China on a limited basis. Okay, so those are our two East Asian superpowers, Japan and then to a bigger extent, China. Because those two countries have now become isolated, this is going to allow European countries to come in and colonize areas that have always been under really strict influence of China. And that, of course, would be in the Indian Ocean. In the map over here, when we talk about Indonesia, and when we talk about all the way over to India, South Asia, all of these places become targets of European colonization. And the nations are going to come and compete in this area of the world. To a small extent, France, but to a bigger extent, Britain, Portugal, and the Dutch. And really, the Portuguese are going to be first. And we know that the Portuguese are first. And we should review how the Portuguese are going to come in and affect things. But let's talk about the British East India Company, because the British East India Company is the longest lasting of these colonization over here in the Indian Ocean. The British East India Company forms in 1600. That is a key date because we follow South Asia throughout the entire course. South Asia, when we think of South Asia, think India. And this is a big turning point in history because here we have a joint stock company. Now, a joint stock company, by definition, is a bunch of investors, private citizens that are looking to benefit from trade over here in India. They're not looking to take over the country, which eventually happens. They're looking to establish a couple of trading posts there and trade with the Mughal Empire. And we say Mughal, the Mughal Empire is our Islamic gunpowder empire that currently controls India. But what the British East India Company starts to do, at first for their own protection, is to build forts. But eventually, they realize that if they have some military might and power, they can conquer some lands and start to more regulate trade there, start to form monopolies of trade in India. And they slowly start to do this. They have Indians looking for a job in India, and because of this, the British East India Company is going to start to hire local Indians to serve as soldiers for their company. These soldiers are called sepoys, and they serve under a British officer, and they serve for the British East India Company. And slowly but surely, they start using force to spread further and further throughout India. This is especially possible in this time period because India, which of course is heavily Hindu, is being controlled by a Muslim government, the Mughals. And because of this, the British East India Company is allowed to uses both sides to play against each other. And the end result is they start conquering more and more land and thus control more and more trade, the very valuable trade, especially the spice trade over there in India. And of course, India eventually becomes the crown jewel of the British Empire when we get into further centuries down the line. Now, the British aren't first. Of course, the Portuguese are first, and the Portuguese arrived in the Indian Ocean with Vasco da Gama actually in the late 15th century. So in the late 1400s, they arrive. And of course, they arrive first because of technology. They have the best ships. They have the best caravels. Vasco da Gama is going to make his way around the Cape of Good Hope. He's going to stop into these places down here, the Swahili states, and build forts there. But if you look at all the purple dots, this is where the Portuguese really colonize the most. They make their way into the Middle East, many places in India, and then over into Malacca and Indonesia here, making it as far as Japan. And so obviously the Portuguese have done a tremendous job by 1600 in regulating and controlling the Indian Ocean. And this represents a change because the Indian Ocean trade has gone on for centuries. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And up until the Portuguese, there has never been a reason to arm your merchant ships. If you were a merchant from Eastern Africa, if you're a merchant from the Middle East, you're an Arab merchant, or if you're coming from China or India, it doesn't matter. You don't have to arm your ship. There's no reason to have to protect yourself in the Indian Ocean because it's understood that everybody benefits from trade. Everybody is getting rich off of going to these new places. And so free trade is allowed. And in fact, in places like Calicut, for instance, in Western Africa, in Western India, the local leaders actually wanted merchants to come in and trade in their places because it brought them wealth and prestige and these foreign goods. And so the Portuguese are going to come in and really disrupt this system. The Portuguese are going to completely ignore the regulations that have gone on for hundreds and hundreds of years. And they're going to come in and build forts. And these forts are designed to be military outposts with the purpose of regulating trade. What they're going to do is they're going to use military ships to force every ship that travels in the Indian Ocean to have a license that is given by them. And of course, they have to pay for that license. And so they're going to make money off of licensing. And if ships don't have a license, then they were considered as running contraband. They were considered as illegal ships, and they could be boarded. All of their wares could be confiscated. And so this was a way for the Portuguese to make a lot of money. And this money would go back to the Portuguese government, who then in turn could use that money to pay for more ships. This was a complex system in which they controlled a complete monopoly over the spice trade, and they made additional money through licensing vessels. And so as a reaction to this, we're going to have many reactions. Some states, some city-states are going to try to fight back against the Portuguese. For instance, the Ottoman Empire did this. Some states are simply going to have to adhere to what the Portuguese are asking and start to license with the Portuguese in order to do this. And really the thing that starts to create some relative calm and stop this kind of violence from occurring is not really the states in Southeast Asia that start to fight back. It's more other European states that come in and start to challenge the Portuguese and end this complete domination and monopoly over the spice trade. One of the ways in which the Portuguese come in and gain this monopoly is an early battle, the Battle of Diu. The Portuguese arrive in the Indian Ocean. They have their military superiority. They take control of trade. They create these armed trading posts. And they're going to have to win a decisive victory early on against the Gujaratis, which is from the very wealthy city-state of Gujarat over in Western India. And then also Calicut. And Calicut got help from Venice all the way over in Italy. And the thought process here is that the Venetians wanted to be able to come in and trade over with India, just like so many other Western European states. And they resented the fact that Portugal was forming a monopoly over this. But the Portuguese win this early battle, and this helps them establish this monopoly in the Indian Ocean. However, it's short-lived, and one of the reasons why, well, there's several reasons why the Portuguese lose this trading post empire in Asia. For one, it's a smaller country compared to some of the big superpowers, and because it's a smaller country, they lack the manpower to regulate this large ocean, the Indian Ocean, of trade. There's lots of ships that are getting by their military, their enforcements. Also, some of these ships that come in and are supposed to be enforcing the monopoly can be bribed. And because of this, the Portuguese government starts losing money and money that they should have been getting through the regulation of trade there. And therefore, without the money, they can't buy more ships and build more ships to be able to regulate the Indian Ocean. Of course, the other two reasons are competition from external threats, the Dutch and then the British. The Dutch come in, regulate the spice trade in Malaysia, and then the British are going to come into India. The Dutch East India Company, the Dutch are going to arrive and they are going to take control of Indonesia from the Portuguese. They're just like the British East India Company are going to use a joint stock company to do this. So this is a privately owned company that is going to come in and control Indonesia, which becomes known as the Dutch East Indies. They are going to gain a monopoly on the spice trade. Now, you see down here, granted a monopoly by the Dutch crown on the spice trade. The thought process in why would the Dutch crown, I say the Dutch crown, the Dutch government, the monarchs of the Netherlands, why would they allow this private company to control all spice trade? Well, this private company has lots of wealth. They have tremendous amount of investors that have come in and created this joint stock company. And the Dutch crown sees this as a win-win. We'll allow this private company to enforce this monopoly. They're going to have to spend money on ships that are able to use their cannons and force to be able to keep this monopoly. And we're going to be able to heavily tax this company and make lots of wealth for ourselves. And so we see with many of our joint stock companies, like the Dutch East India Company, like the British East India Company, like the Virginia Company in Jamestown, all of these joint stock companies are formed initially for private wealth of their investors, but the states are benefiting too because they're taxing these joint stock companies. The trading posts that are established in all of these places are going to lead to globalization, more connection from all parts of the world, because these trading posts are going to become nodes. And what that means is because we have Western Europeans all the way over as far as China, all the way as far as Japan, Indonesia, all these places, we see goods from Western Europe in places you've never seen before. And merchants can come in and find goods from all over the world in places that they've never been found before. This thus is showing that we are coming together as a globe. This is the process of globalization. Okay, I know we've talked about mercantilism many times, but I'm going to mention it again because it really is what makes the world go round between 1450 and 1750, because this is the reason why we have our first era of colonization. Mercantilism is measuring the wealth of your nation by the gold and silver in its vaults. And again, there are more than one ways in which you can get gold and silver in your vaults. You could go in and just take it from someone, as we saw, especially with the Spanish. You can come in and bring in a bunch of imports from your colonies and then trade those imports for gold and silver. And that, therefore, forming colonies becomes a very important aspect of this, because you are bringing in things, even things, if you use the North American colonies, for example, the British colonies, places like New England that were one of their major economic ventures was lumber. There's a bunch of trees over in the New World because Native Americans didn't really chop down the trees. And so they start chopping down all these trees and then sending them back to England. And England is going to be able to take those trees and make them into ships and then possibly sell those ships for gold. And so all of these imported goods, these raw materials coming from wherever colonies are all over the world, India or Indonesia or North America, they are for the purpose of being able to flip into gold in some way. And there's another element to this. They also can be used as capital. And in general, when we see colonization, we see an increase in capital in the states that are colonizing. Capital, by definition, is wealth that produces more wealth. And in that same example of lumber, talk about New England. New England is one of the British-controlled colonies in the New World, over in modern day Massachusetts, for instance. We have all of these trees. These trees are being chopped down by our British colonists over in Massachusetts. They're going to take this lumber. They're going to put it onto ships, ship it back to England. English shipbuilders there are going to build those ships, and then they're going to use them as transports between the old world and the new world. And now we can transport more goods. And so now all of a sudden, we're able to bring more and more wealth from the new world to the old world. So thus, in this particular case, our ships are our capital. When we think about capital, a lot of times you think of money, but in this case, ships, because capital means wealth, to produce more wealth. Now you have more capability for trade. That is thus capital, because it's producing more wealth. Because we see all of this, imported goods from the colonies, we see capital in general is going to grow in Europe, and we have money in the hands of more and more people, middle class growing. And this is going to lead to some very wealthy private citizens. We really haven't seen private wealth in the middle class at this magnitude in Europe in history. I mean, it's been very, very easy to understand where the wealth is in Europe up until this point. It's going to be in the hands of the lords or the king. But now we have these average everyday citizens that have made money through trade, big time money through trade. And so now we have private citizens that start to become bankers, that start to become very wealthy banking families. For instance, the Medici family in Italy that is going to loan a tremendous amount of money and gain wealth and political influence out of this. Um, the church has been fighting this battle for a long time. And they said that Christians should not be allowed to charge interest on other Christians. However, as very typical of this time period, 1450 to 1750, the Catholic Church has lost a lot of influence. And we start to see this being regular practice, banking and charging interest being regular practice. This is going to lead to a overall change in trade. We start to see state trade and state regulated trade. Before in history, we've only had merchants trading with other merchants, and the state could, of course, tax those merchants. We start to see the state can take a really vested control over the economy. European economies now are saying we are going to trade in bulk and we are going to trade only using gold and silver. And that's really what gives the validation to mercantilism, because it's saying if you want to trade for these raw materials, these goods that we have from these colonies, if you want to trade, for instance, for the spices that we have taken from India or from Indonesia, then you've got to trade with gold and silver. And so we start to see the gold standard emerging in Europe, where if you want to have these wonderful luxuries of life, you need to have access to gold. And to have gold, you need to be able to establish a favorable balance of trade. And to do that, you need colonies. So all of this intersects, right? All of these things intersect. And there's this huge rush to go out and find colonies in order to be able to gain gold and to gain access to all these wonderful things in life. Of course, when you see lots of gold coming into a given state or a given continent, in this case in Western Europe, you're going to see inflation. It's not just gold and silver, where we have all of this, silver or gold coming into the country. Therefore, because you have all of it, we have this huge amount of supply. Therefore, the price of gold is going to decline. And therefore, if you have a currency of, say, gold or silver, that you're going to see some inflation. So, if you're selling bread in a market and there's not very much gold around, okay, gold is going to be scarce. It's going to be in high demand, and so you can sell your bread for only a limited amount of gold because there's not very much of it. If there's a tremendous amount of gold in the country, you're going to raise your prices, right? You're going to raise your prices of bread by raising a price of a good. That's inflation, right? Because your money buys less, and so that especially is going to hit Spain really hard, especially with all the silver coming into Spain from the New World, especially those two mines. Zacatecas and Potosi. All right, let's talk about joint stock companies. So we've got a solid definition of these things. Joint stock companies are where investors coming together, they're buying stock or shares in a business. And then by buying a stock or a share in a business, you now have control or partial control of that business. And the thought process early on is, we are going to invest in some adventurers, and that's where that term venture capitalists come from. We are going to invest in some adventurers. They're going to go over and try and colonize a given place, and they're going to get wealth. They're going to bring that wealth back, and we're going to strike it rich, right? Now, of course, sometimes you invest in a bunch of adventurers and they don't strike it rich. They don't find gold or silver or anything of value. And then you could potentially lose your money. And if the company goes into a severe amount of debt, these investors might lose it all. Well, no, and this is another key aspect of joint stock companies. Joint stock companies have limited liability. And that means that investor is only responsible for what they invest in. So, for instance, if JP is an investor in the Virginia company and he invests 100, gold pieces, we'll say 100 florins into the company, and the company unfortunately doesn't do very well. They don't find any gold, and the company starts to go thousands of florins into debt. JP is only liable for the initial investment he put in, which was 100 florins. Many of these joint stock companies famously do become very successful, like the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company. However, there are some examples that are not very successful, and I'll talk about those in just a second. But first, the forgotten colonizers, the Dutch. The Dutch are a relatively small state in Western Europe, and yet they're playing with the big boys in this era. And one of the reasons why is they successfully made some economic practices. They pioneered some economic practices that made them lots of wealth. For instance, they had created the first stock exchange, where you could come in and publicly buy stock and trade in stock in companies. And so people, rich middle class people or rich upper class people from all around Europe would come to the Dutch Republic in order to trade and invest in companies. And while they were there, they would invest in the local economy, and this would obviously help the Dutch Republic. They also established the Bank of Amsterdam, which is also really genius. All of the different states in Western Europe use different currencies. And in fact, some cities use different currencies. And so it's very difficult at times to trade in Western Europe because you didn't know exactly what currency was worth. It might be silver on the outside, but then tin on the inside, right? It's very difficult. The Bank of Amsterdam were masters of knowing the value of each and every currency of each and every place in Western Europe, and then being able to exchange those currencies so everybody could come there and trade. And because of this, many people did come there and trade, and it made the Dutch the center of financial dealings in Europe, which made them very wealthy and successful. Okay, back to joint stock companies. So yes, there are times in which joint stock companies were very unsuccessful in this time period. And because there were some early successes in joint stock companies, there were then some bubbles, some financial bubbles. And the thought process is, okay, you've got, let's use the Missouri bubble in France as the best example. The French are late to the colonization game. They're obviously behind the Portuguese, they're behind the Spanish, and they want to make some money, and they see that people are coming over and making money from the Americas. And so the French are going to come in. Samuel de Champlain, Jacques Cartier, the French explorers, find Canada, and then they sail down the Mississippi River and they find Louisiana. And Louisiana is this new discovery claimed for the French. And all of these people in France are so excited. They're reading about this in the newspaper, that there's this newly discovered huge amount of land in the New World. And they've heard about all of the wealth in the New World, all the gold and silver. And so there is a joint stock company that is created, the Missouri Company, and the Mississippi Company. And the Mississippi Company is going to say, okay, why don't you invest? We're taking investment. Buy as much stock in our company as you want. And so people start investing as much money as they have. I'll put in 100 francs, and I'll put in 1,000 francs, and I'll put all this and all that. And so this company has all this money, right? And then they look around Louisiana and they look everywhere they can for gold, and they don't find any gold. They find beavers. They don't find anything of value, really. And so because of this, the company's not profitable. And so now you're paying all these people to look for gold. They're not finding gold. The company's not generating any wealth. And so all of a sudden, all of these investors now are not seeing a return on their investment. The company starts going into debt. People start losing a lot of money. Finally, people realize, oh crap, I got to sell my stock in this company. So people start frenziedly selling. And unfortunately, if you're one of the people that were left in there, your initial investment might have disappeared. And so these bubbles are going to catch some of these countries that invested in joint stock companies in some really bad economic ventures. This especially is going to hit France And France economy already is really skewed with the fact that their top two estates don't pay taxes, and that's unfortunately going to contribute to the French Revolution. Speaking of comparing, let's talk about how each of these five colonizing countries made their wealth in this time period. The Dutch, the English, and the French. The Dutch, the English, and the French are all investing in joint stock companies, and you can look at the examples I just gave: the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, or the Mississippi Company. Spain and Portugal didn't use Dutch. They did not use joint stock companies. They instead were going to use explorers to come in. The Portuguese colonized, of course, Brazil, and then they had their licensing trading post empire in the Indian Ocean. The Spanish, on the other hand, were empire builders. They were there to claim as much land as possible for the crown, because the Spanish really were looking for the three G's, which is gold, God, and glory. And so they're going to set up systems like the encomienda system that is going to achieve as many of those things as possible, where they're going to gain land with glory. The encomendero then is going to try and Christianize the people working on that land, and the people working on that land are going to provide silver and gold. So that was kind of the differences between our colonizers. And we see state chartered monopolies, which I've talked about briefly, but just go through it one more time. So European monarchs are going to grant monopolies to joint stock companies for the purpose of making wealth. And we talked about how the Dutch Republic, the monarch of the Netherlands, is going to grant a monopoly to the Dutch East India Company because it made it easier for the Dutch monarchs to watch over and tax the company. Now, that, of course, is a joint stock company. The Spanish and the Portuguese, they didn't use joint stock companies. So how did they make a lot of wealth out of this? The Spanish government directly controlled the economy. They directly controlled trade, especially in certain goods. We don't think about tobacco when we think about the Spanish, but tobacco was one of the major industries of the Spanish Empire in the New World. And merchants were not allowed to privately trade tobacco. Merchants, if they cultivated tobacco, had to come straight back to Spain and offload that tobacco there. And then the Spanish would then flip that tobacco for gold and silver, which became a huge part of Spain's total revenues. Again, when we're talking about the Spanish and the Portuguese, they're different. The Spanish and the Portuguese, they're there to build empires. And because of this, and because of the fact that they are very religiously motivated to find converts, the Spanish and the Portuguese are going to really try and erase the cultures that they encounter and kind of force their own cultures upon who they colonize. This is really kind of different in what we've seen so far in history. When we look at the multi-ethnic, multi-religious empires that we've encountered so far, we've seen that the easiest way to regulate over these kind of empires is religious tolerance. For instance, the Umayyad or the Abbasid caliphates were very religiously tolerant when they ruled over places that were predominantly Christian or predominantly any different religion. The Mongols, of course, were very religiously tolerant, with the exception of Hulagu. When we look at Akbar in the Mughal Empire, Akbar was the most successful ruler over that empire, and he did it because he was tolerant of other religions. The Spanish and the Portuguese were not going to tolerate other religions. They were going to come in and enforce their own cultural and religious traditions, and there's lots of examples of that. Hernan Cortez, when he attacked the Aztecs, in 1519, finds the Aztec religion, which is polytheistic and has to do with sacrifice. He thinks that this is an unholy religion, and that he is doing his duty as a Catholic to erase these things from history and erase the culture of the Aztecs. And because of this, unfortunately, we see very, very few original accounts of Nahua, the Aztec language that exists today. And especially because the accounts of the Aztecs, we now are getting them primarily from the Spanish. And that's why there's a suggestion that some of the human sacrifice that was conducted by the Aztecs perhaps was exaggerated by the Spanish as justification for them taking over their Aztec culture. The one kind of reliable source that many believe to be accurate to depict Aztec life is something called the Florentine Codex, which was written by a Spanish priest that was very sympathetic to the Aztecs. Talking about how empire builders like the Spanish ruled over their empires. And if you look at this map, guys, over on the right, the Spanish are the most successful colonizers of the first era of colonization. They are all the way down to Argentina. They're coming all the way up through South America, with the exception of Brazil, and then all the way through Central America, and are in modern day United States. They control almost all of the western portion of the United States, and large areas in the Caribbean. And so the Spanish have a huge empire, and that's very difficult to regulate, especially because Spain is 3,000 miles away, sometimes as far as 5,000, 6,000 miles away from Argentina. How is it possibly going to rule over this large empire? Well, of course, they have to create bureaucracies. They'll create bureaucrats called viceroys, which are going to be representatives and ministers of the crown. Those are going to be peninsulares of the peninsulare class, so people born in Spain or Portugal that are now ruling over the New World. But knowing that these people are so far away from the crown, 5,000, 6,000 miles away. That's so far away. It's difficult then for the Spanish crown to keep watch over them, to regulate over them. So as kind of a check on the balance of power of these viceroys, the Spanish crown established audiencias, which were courts where the Spanish settlers, if they thought that their rights were being violated or that they were not being held accountable to the same laws as they would in Spain, they could actually appeal the viceroy's decisions, and that would actually be handled by royal administrators of the crown, of royal representatives of the crown. So smart strategy by the Spanish there. This, you guys will remember, was a major change in the Americas controlled by the Spanish. The Spanish are going to enforce a new social hierarchy that is based upon race and ancestry, both of those things. It matters what the color of your skin was, but also where you were born. And the biggest example of that was the difference between our peninsulares and our creoles. In the top of society, in the New World, Spanish controlled America. The very top would be the pure white Europeans that were born on the Iberian Peninsula, that were born in either Spain or Portugal. Those are going to be the people that are at the top of the social structure. Our creoles, second in line, are still 100% European descent, but they were born in the Americas. And so what that means is that there is race is a huge factor, but also ancestry, where you were born, is significant, because the peninsulares are on top, the creoles next, and then comes our mixed ancestry. If you have European blood, okay, then you are kind of the middle class in Spanish society. Our mestizos are European and Native American. Our mulattoes are European and African descent. And then if you have no European in you at all, then you're going to be at the bottom of society, like our Zombos, which are African and Native American, and then our Native Americans down at the very bottom. And so the Spanish enforce a ruthless racial hierarchy in the New World. And this is a great example of their cultural destruction of the society that existed previously. They're also, because of their 3Gs, going to try and convert their peoples, their subjects, if you will, to Roman Catholicism, because of course, the Portuguese and the Spanish were Catholic. And so if you look at South America today, it is by and large Catholic. I mean, this is the most Catholic continent in the world. But because you have this mixture of all of these different peoples in South America, that you're going to start to see some syncretic religions emerging. Of course, the peoples that would be in South America at this stage are Europeans, Native Americans, and then slaves from West Africa. The places where you are going to see Catholicism least entrenched, are going to be the places where the most slaves came. Because when slaves come, they're going to bring their West African religious traditions with them. And that is where we're going to see more syncretic religions form that are based off of Christianity, but also have elements of West African traditions as well. We have lots of examples of this. So we have 3 examples where we see West African religion mixing with Catholicism: Vodun, which means spirit or deity. This is where that word voodoo comes from, although it's kind of making fun of the religion. So voodoo isn't really used that way, but it starts with peoples in West Africa, Dahomey and Congo, and then they're going to come in and be enslaved in modern day Haiti. And therefore, Vodun today is still practiced in modern day Haiti. Santeria, which is very popular in Cuba, is going to come from Africa as well, and then mixed with Christianity, it means the way of the saints. And then Candomblé were actually developed in Brazil because of how many slaves came to Brazil. And this was also a combination of African beliefs that also mixed with Christianity as well. And our final little section of the lecture today is on external and internal conflicts. This is an era of violence, 1450 to 1750, and it's an era of violence both internally, within colonies, within states, and also externally between different states. Why do we have so many conflicts? One, the power of the monarchs is rising in relation to the local elites, meaning the power of the monarchs is rising in power to either the nobles or the church, for instance. We also see empires that are being built overseas, obviously going to have conflict with the indigenous peoples there. And then more conflict when indigenous peoples and West Africans are forced into labor systems. When the Spanish claimed North America over in the West, Western North America, all the way up to California, modern day Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, all of these things, we are going to see some conflict with Native American tribes there. Starting with Cortez conquering the Aztecs in Mexico, Spanish colonists, just like English colonists, moved west from the English colonies over on the East Coast. We have Spanish colonists moving north, and they're going to come into the modern day United States. They're looking, of course, for the 3Gs as always. They're looking for gold, God, and glory. They don't find these things, but they do find lots of people to convert. And so they're converting people along the way. This is where we'll see Father Junipero Serra build a mission system over in California. We're looking to convert Native Americans to Christianity. But finally, in 1680, we have a fight back. We have an indigenous revolt called the Pueblo Revolt, where the Pueblo and the Apache tribe rebel against the Spanish colonists. It's an organized revolt. They move through, they kill colonists along their way, and they literally destroy every single Catholic church in a resentment for the cultural destruction that is ensuing here. The Spanish are going to send reinforcements, but it's going to take 12 years to completely recapture this land. We also see internal struggles in the British colonies, and there's two results for this. First of all, the British at first use indentured servitude, and indentured servants were essentially slaves, but for a temporary point of time, for 5 to 7 years. We also start to see slaves from West Africa coming over into the British colonies. And indentured servants and Africans both, West Africans enslaved, had lots in common. They could be beaten, they could be whipped, they worked from dawn till dusk. And this first rebellion, the Gloucester County Rebellion, is going to be these two groups working together. The enslaved Africans and indentured servants, they conspire together to march on the Virginia governor's home. However, their authorities are going to find out their plot and ambush and arrest them before the rebellion even starts. And then we have, once again, an indigenous conflict. Metacom's War was the Wampanoag tribe fighting against the British, moving further and further into New England. The British colonies, all of the colonies are going to come together to fight against this Indian revolt, they called it, and they were going to push the Wampanoag people out of their ancestral lands as the British continue to move west into North America. And speaking of the British moving west into North America, we have a major conflict that ensues. We've got two longtime rivals, the British and the French, and they have started to colonize the Americas. And here we are getting now 100 years after initial colonization, and we're starting to run out of room over here on the eastern portion of the United States, and that's going to cause France and England to start to fight it out over land, especially land over here in what we call the Ohio River Valley. So our situation is that the British kicked out the Dutch out of modern day New York in 1664. And up there in New York, they found a very powerful Iroquois tribe, which really, to call it a tribe is incorrect. It's actually 5 tribes in a confederacy. And having this confederacy as an ally was very, very important. And so the British bribed the Iroquois as much as they possibly could. They gave them gold and guns. But the British, as we know, were the worst in treating Native Americans. And the Iroquois realized that if it came to a battle between the British and the French, they would benefit far more if the French were victorious because the French were much kinder to Native Americans. And they traded with them. They didn't treat them as a threat. And so because of this, the Iroquois actually switched alliances and allied with the French in a peace treaty called the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701. And this is going to set the stage for what becomes a massive conflict, one of the first world wars in history, what we call the French and Indian War, what the Europeans called the 7 Years' War. And again, this is a conflict that ensues because the British want to move west and further into the North American continent, but the French are already entrenched there. They've built chains and forts as they follow the beaver further into the continent. And so because of this, we have our spark, a Virginian, still a British citizen, George Washington, 21-year-old George Washington is going to come into the Ohio River Valley looking to secure some land there. He is fired upon, and these are our first shots of the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763. It is a long, hard-fought war that is fought in many, many different places. It's fought in 7 different seas. It's fought in Europe. It is fought in the Americas. And the long-lasting impact of this is that France is completely kicked out of North America. France is no longer on the continent. They're also kicked out of India as the British win a huge victory in this war. And the British are now going to start to kick the Spanish out of the Caribbean. And they used their navy to push Spain out of Jamaica, which was a very profitable sugar colony at the time. But the English then inherit the problems that the Spanish were having with the indigenous peoples, both the indigenous peoples and slaves. We saw lots of slave revolts, the Caribbean, huge sugar-producing locations, but these sugar-producing locations, like Brazil, are going to have lots of slaves. In fact, a majority of slaves. And so slave revolts were numerous, and they were very, very dangerous to European colonists. Between 1728 and 1796, continued slave revolts were called the Maroon Wars. Maroons are going to be runaway slaves that have escaped and then have organized together to fight back against slavery and colonization in general. Oftentimes they were disorganized and there were small little rebellions, but one former slave, one Maroon, came to prominence, Queen Nanny, because she united all the Maroons of Jamaica to fight back against English colonization. And today she's found on their currency. She's a national hero. Almost done, guys. We're getting to resistance in Africa. And so this is where we revisit Anna Nzinga, who is a famous figure in African history. She has a kingdom of Ndongo, and Ndongo is in Western Africa. And the Portuguese are looking for ways to gain more wealth. The Portuguese have been kicked out of the Indian Ocean, and so now they're raiding Western Africa looking for slaves to participate in the slave trade. And they start raiding the kingdom of Ndongo, who our queen Anna Nzinga presides over. Anna Nzinga is an amazing, amazing negotiator. And what she does is she's going to ally with the Portuguese. And she's going to say, why don't you become our ally? You will not raid our state. You will help us from other countries, other states around us raiding our state. And we will trade profitably with you. And we will help you guys gain wealth. And because of this, she actually converts. She is baptized and becomes a Christian. And she believes that this has solved the matter. Well, the Portuguese are going to betray her. The Portuguese are going to actually start to demand tribute from Ndongo. And then Ananzinga is providing shelter for escaped slaves. They can't have this, and so the Portuguese are going to order her killed and removed from power. Ananzinga is going to flee to the east with her people into the state of Matamba, where she takes over there. And then, seeing an opportunity, she allies with the Portuguese's biggest rival, the Dutch, and they're going to use the Dutch and ally with the Dutch to fight against the Portuguese. This is one of our few examples of an African state fighting off a European colonizer in this time period, which was a huge victory for Ananzinga and makes her a hero. Our last two slides, or I believe our last three slides, we revisit Russia, because Russia in this time period is not colonizing. They are not going out and conquering new lands overseas. They are moving into Siberia, and I shouldn't say no colonizing overseas. They did make their way into Alaska, but they aren't participating really in the major era of colonization. But Peter the First does make some very notable changes. Peter the Great, he is going to westernized Russia. We have a modern navy, bureaucracies, we've got a warm water port, but all of these changes is going to make the serfs more oppressed in Russia than ever. Serfdom is going to last in Russia until 1861, which is a very, very long time. And it is so popular because the nobles get free labor on their land, and the Tsar gets control over the nobles and control over the serfs, because the nobles have to constantly be watching out for serf rebellions. Well, one serf rebellion is going to occur under the reign of Catherine II, otherwise known as Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great is going to marry Peter the Great's grandson, who is Peter III. But Peter III is a sickly boy who becomes an alcoholic at 13. And Peter is going to die actually quite mysteriously in 1762, and his new wife, Catherine, becomes the Tsarina of Russia, the first Tsarina of Russia. And we used to learn a lot more about Catherine. Unfortunately, we don't anymore. But what we do learn about is that Catherine has to deal with a major rebellion called the Pugachev Rebellion. The Pugachev Rebellion is going to be started by a Cossack by the name of Yemelyan Pugachev. Yemelyan Pugachev is going to do something very rash. He is going to rally the Cossacks on the edge of Russian society. And he's going to do this by claiming that he is Catherine's deceased husband. He is Peter III, and that his death has been exaggerated. He is not dead at all. He is alive, and that he is going to, if the Cossacks and the former escaped slaves and all of the serfs and the discontented peasants rally behind him, that he will march on Russia, he will conquer Russia, and he will abolish serfdom forever. And he attempts to do this, and he comes in and conquers a huge amount of land in Russia here, and he holds that land for a year. Catherine repeatedly tries to push him out of this land. She can't do it. And so she is forced to turn to the nobles for help. And she says, "Nobles, will you help me put down this rebellion?" And the nobles, who have been put down and put down and put down over the last 100 years as the Tsar's rise in power and prominence, the nobles say, "Aha, we knew you would come to us and ask for help. And yes, we will help you put down the Yemelyan Pugachev rebellion. But in the future, you must help us put down future serf revolts and keep serfdom alive." And because of this, Catherine is forced to make this deal with the nobles to continue to keep the serfs suppressed. And this is one of the biggest consequences of this rebellion, is serfdom becomes worse than ever in this time period. All right, guys, here is our partner DBQ. And I just want to give you guys this warning that this DBQ is no joke. This is actually a very tricky DBQ. It is a former AP test DBQ. And as we get closer to the AP test, I'm going to do my best to kind of throw some tricky ones at you guys. And this one has some longer sources. And it also has a source that really befuddled a lot of the country when it was on the AP test. And it's this one right here. I want you guys to practice a difficult DBQ, because it's only going to help you guys. I will just remind you guys that as long as I see you guys putting full effort into this DBQ, you guys are going to get full credit on it. I'm not going to take away points if you make a mistake, because I want you guys to, feel like you can go in and try to do these your best without having to worry about trying to go and look up answers or anything like that. All right, guys. I will see you guys very soon. Good luck. Thanks for listening. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye.